Welcome back to Season 2, Episode 16, a question and answer session of Workers Comp Unwrapped with Max. I'm your host, and I'm excited to have with us Aisha, who has 15 years of experience in the workers' comp industry.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Today, we're tackling some of the most common questions about workers' comp fraud that we get from our audience.
Yeah, sounds good.
Specifically from medical providers, billing specialists, and legal professionals.
Absolutely. And it's a hot topic.
It is.
Everyone wants to make sure that they're navigating these tricky waters and, doing the right thing.
And so the first question is from a provider who asks, how do I handle a patient I suspect is exaggerating or faking their injury?
Yeah, that is a tough one. You want to make sure that you're providing excellent care, but at the same time, be wary of any potential fraud.
Right.
I think the key here is to really focus on objective medical evidence.
Okay.
And, not jumping to conclusions about fraud, but letting that evidence lead you.
So what would be some concrete steps a provider can take to ensure that they are covered?
So first off, I think it's really important to make sure that your clinical evaluations are thorough.
Okay.
So you're not just relying on what the patient's telling you, but you're actually using diagnostic tools like range of motion assessments and imaging studies and any other relevant tests to really get a full picture of their injury.
So it's like building that solid foundation of evidence, right? You need that to compare again.
Exactly, that baseline.
Yeah.
And then as you're gathering all that evidence, you really want to compare the patient's reported symptoms to your actual medical findings.
Okay.
Right? So for example, let's say somebody's claiming debilitating back pain that prevents them from walking, but your exam shows no physical abnormalities and they're, walking around the exam room just fine. That's a discrepancy. That really needs to be carefully documented.
So you're really connecting the dots between what they're saying and what your expertise is telling you.
Yeah, exactly. And another thing to really watch out for is their behavior. Somebody might be claiming limited mobility in the exam room, but then you see them walking around normally outside.
Oh, right.
Yeah, that's another red flag. And again, you want to make sure you're documenting that.
It sounds like careful observation and detailed documentation are like providers' best friends in these situations.
Absolutely. And, if you're still unsure after doing all of that, don't hesitate to get a second opinion.
Okay.
So you can do that through something like an independent medical exam, an IME, or a functional capacity evaluation, which is also called an FCE.
Got it.
And that can just provide, an objective assessment from another medical professional just to get another set of eyes on the case.
That makes a lot of sense to get that added layer of certainty.
And through it all, really just stick to the medical facts. Don't make any assumptions about fraud. Just document everything clearly. Let that speak for itself.
That's great advice, and it protects you and ensures that you're providing the most appropriate care. Now, this next question comes from a provider who's a little worried about liability.
Okay.
They're asking, can my practice be held liable if I unknowingly treat a fraudulent claim?
Oh, that's a good question. And I bet it's a concern for a lot of providers out there.
Yeah, and the answer is not so simple.
Right.
Unfortunately, even if you're completely unaware that a claim is fraudulent, being linked to it can still open you up to audits, clawbacks, or even legal scrutiny.
Yeah, that's the part that makes it a little bit scary. You could be penalized for something that you had no idea was even happening.
Exactly. But the good news is that following the proper documentation procedures, maintaining billing compliance, and sticking to ethical medical practices significantly minimizes that risk.
Okay.
So it's all about having those safeguards built into your practice from the get-go.
Absolutely. And to kind of break that down a little bit, billing accuracy is really important.
Yeah.
Make sure that you're not upcoding or billing for treatments that aren't medically necessary.
Right.
Any discrepancies there, even if it's an honest mistake, can raise some red flags.
And that leads to the next point, right? Having those thorough patient evaluations.
Oh, yes.
Making sure that your treatment plan is always based on the medical necessity.
Exactly. And that not only ensures that you're providing the right care, but it also creates that clear record. A very defensible record if your billing is ever questioned.
Right. It shows that you're doing things for the right reasons.
Exactly. It shows that you're making those decisions based on what's medically sound.
Yeah. Transparency and evidence are key.
Absolutely. And then the last thing I would say on this is just be cautious about your legal partnerships.
Well,
So watch out for red flags like referral kickbacks, or if you have a lot of cases coming from one particular attorney all of a sudden, those can be potential signs of fraud schemes.
it's like you're choosing your allies wisely, building those good ethical relationships.
Right, exactly. To protect yourself in the long run.
And the big takeaway here is If a fraud investigation happens, your clinical notes and your compliance records are your best defense.
Absolutely. Being able to demonstrate that you've been diligent and ethical really puts you in a much stronger position.
I love that. And it emphasizes proactive measures
Right.
and building that culture of compliance within your practice.
For sure.
Now, this next question is one I know a lot of people are wondering about.
Okay.
It's, how can I report suspected fraud anonymously?
Yeah.
I think a lot of people are afraid to come forward because they fear retaliation.
Yeah, it's understandable. Nobody wants to risk their career or reputation by speaking up.
Right.
But it is important to know that you don't have to stay silent.
Mhm.
There are ways that you can report your concerns without having to reveal your identity.
So what are those options? How can you do it anonymously?
So most states actually have dedicated fraud reporting hotlines specifically for this purpose.
Okay.
So you can call those hotlines and share your suspicions without fear of retaliation.
That's a good idea.
And a lot of the major workers' comp insurers also have confidential fraud reporting portals on their websites. So it's really as simple as filling out a secure online form and submitting it.
So you have multiple options depending on how comfortable you are.
Exactly. And if you work within a larger medical group or a hospital, you can always reach out to your compliance officer or your legal team.
Mm-hmm.
They're trained to handle these situations, and they can kind of guide you through the process confidentially.
That's really good to know that you have those internal resources if you need them.
Yeah, and reporting suspected fraud, it's important for maintaining the integrity of the entire workers' comp system.
Right.
It really ensures that everybody is being treated fairly and that those resources are being used responsibly.
Now let's move on to employer fraud.
Okay.
A listener is asking, what's the most common type of employer fraud that providers should be aware of?
Oh, that's a good question.
I'm curious what your take is on that one.
One of the most common schemes we see is employee misclassification. And that's where employers are intentionally misclassifying their employees' job duties in order to lower their workers' comp premiums.
Oh, wow. So how would that work?
So, for example, imagine a construction company, right? They have a lot of construction workers.
High risk of injury.
Exactly. High risk of injury. To reduce their insurance costs, they might classify those workers as clerical staff on their payroll.
Oh, wow.
Clerical work has a much lower risk of injury and therefore lower premiums.
So they're kind of trying to game the system to save some money.
Exactly. And it ends up putting those workers at risk.
Right.
Because if they do get injured, they might not be receiving the appropriate benefits that they're entitled to.
That's terrible. So are there any other things that employers do to avoid paying legitimate claims?
Yeah. Another common tactic is discouraging legitimate claims.
Okay.
So some employers might pressure doctors to downplay the severity of injuries or rush workers back to work before they've fully recovered.
It's awful that they would put profits over the well-being of their employees.
Yeah. Unfortunately, it happens more often than you think.
Why?
And, sometimes employers even resort to threats.
Okay.
Warning workers that they'll be fired if they file a claim.
That's just outrageous.
Yeah, it's unethical and it's illegal.
As a provider, you really have to be aware of those things.
Absolutely.
And advocate for your patients.
Yeah, and as a provider, if an employer ever asks you to alter a diagnosis or limit treatment to reduce claim costs, that's a huge red flag.
Okay.
You want to document any pressure like that and report it to the appropriate authorities.
It takes courage, but it's definitely the right thing to do.
It is.
Now, this next question deals with a situation that I think a lot of our listeners have probably encountered at some point.
Okay.
A listener's asking, what should I do if I suspect a colleague or another provider is committing billing fraud?
Ooh, yeah, that can be a sensitive situation.
Yeah, it's hard to know how to proceed.
It is. And I think the first thing to remember is that, not all billing errors are intentional. Sometimes it could be a genuine oversight or just a misunderstanding of the coding guidelines.
Right.
And making accusations without being absolutely certain can have serious consequences.
So how do you know if it's an honest mistake versus something more deliberate? What are some signs that should raise a red flag?
Yeah, so if you notice a pattern of upcoding or phantom billing or excessive treatments that just don't seem medically necessary, that's definitely ones for concern.
Gotcha.
For example, if a colleague's consistently billing for a more complex procedure when a simpler one would have sufficed, or if they're billing for services that were never actually provided, those are definitely red flags that warrant further investigation.
So once you see those potential red flags, what's the next step? How do you address the situation without, jeopardizing your own professional standing?
Yeah, so I think, start by trying to rule out any innocent explanations.
Yeah.
So talk to your billing department. See if maybe there are some coding errors or some misunderstandings. There might be a simple explanation that can be easily resolved. If your concerns remain after you check with billing, then I think it's time to dig a little bit deeper.
Right.
Review the patient records carefully, see if the billed services align with that documented medical necessity.
So it's all about gathering the evidence and confirming those suspicions before taking any action.
Exactly. And if, after reviewing the records, you still believe that there's a strong possibility of fraudulent billing, then it's time to involve your compliance officer.
They would be the expert to guide you through the next steps.
Absolutely. They can help determine if further action is needed.
Yep.
And they can advise you on those proper reporting channels.
Good.
Remember, your reputation is valuable. So addressing suspected fraudulent billing internally
Right.
or through the appropriate channels rather than making public accusations really helps to protect you, and it ensures that the matter's handled professionally.
It's about acting with integrity and professionalism, even when things are difficult.
Absolutely. And then, if after consulting with your compliance officer, if it's determined that further action is warranted, then they can help you, guide you through the process of reporting those concerns to the appropriate authority.
So who would those authorities typically be?
It depends on the specifics of the situation.
Okay.
Sometimes it might be the state medical board. In other cases, it might be the state's fraud division or even the insurer directly.
Okay.
Your compliance officer is going to know the best channels for your specific situation.
It's reassuring to know that there are those systems in place and those people to guide you if you need it.
Yeah, and remember, reporting suspected fraud, it's not about getting anybody in trouble.
Right.
It's about protecting the integrity of the system, making sure that patients are receiving quality care,
Right.
and that those valuable resources are not being misused.
That's a great point. It's about doing the right thing for everyone involved.
Exactly.
It takes courage, but it's so important to maintain those ethical standards in healthcare.
Absolutely. We all have a responsibility to protect the integrity of that system.
I love that.
Speaking of responsibility, our next question comes from a billing specialist who wants to know about the financial impact of all this. They're asking, how much does workers' comp fraud actually cost the system? I imagine the numbers are pretty staggering.
Yeah, they really are. The National Insurance Crime Bureau estimates that workers' comp fraud costs billions of dollars each year in the U.S. alone.
Wow.
And to put that into perspective for our listeners, that massive cost trickles down to all of us.
Yeah.
And can potentially add hundreds of dollars to your annual insurance premiums.
Yeah, that's a sobering thought. And it's not just about the money that's lost on these fake claims either.
Right.
There are these ripple effects that impact the whole system.
It's like a domino effect, right?
Yeah.
So what other consequences do we see as a result of workers' comp fraud?
So we see direct costs, of course, like medical expenses and indemnity payments for those fraudulent claims. But then there are also these indirect costs,
Okay.
like increased insurance premiums for employers, administrative costs associated with investigating and litigating those fraudulent claims, and then lost productivity as employers are dealing with the fallout.
So it's a lose-lose situation for everyone except, of course, the fraudsters.
Exactly. Employers face higher premiums, consumers end up paying higher prices for goods and services, and legitimate injured workers might face more skepticism and scrutiny when they file a claim.
Right, they're the ones that really suffer.
Yeah, everyone bears the burden of this dishonest behavior.
And that's why it's so important to be vigilant and proactive, in preventing and detecting the fraud.
Absolutely.
Now, shifting gears a bit, we have a legal professional who wants to know more about the legal ramifications.
Okay.
They ask, what are the penalties for committing workers' comp fraud? I imagine the consequences could be pretty severe.
They absolutely are. Workers' comp fraud is a serious crime.
Okay.
And the penalties vary depending on the severity of the offense and the state where it occurs. But in many states, it's a felony offense that can result in hefty fines, imprisonment, or both.
So it's not something to take lightly?
No, not at all.
You could face serious repercussions.
Yeah, and in addition to those criminal penalties, individuals convicted of workers' comp fraud might also face civil lawsuits.
Oh, wow.
From insurers, employers, or even injured workers who were denied benefits because of that fraudulent activity.
So you have the criminal consequences and then you have the civil consequences.
Exactly. It's a double whammy.
Wow.
And beyond that, individuals found guilty of fraud may also be barred from working in certain industries or professions.
Right.
So the impact on your future can be really significant.
Yeah, it really underscores the seriousness of this issue. So let's talk about combating fraud. A provider asks, how can technology be used to detect and prevent workers' comp fraud? It's a good question, especially considering how rapidly technology is advancing.
Yeah, it really is, and technology is becoming an increasingly powerful tool in the fight against fraud.
Okay.
So we're seeing things like data analytics being used to identify patterns and anomalies in claims data that might indicate fraud. So, for example, if a particular provider is consistently billing for more expensive procedures than their peers,
Okay.
or if a certain employer has an unusually high number of claims,
Right.
that might trigger further investigation.
So it's leveraging the power of all that data to identify those potential red flags
Exactly.
that might have been missed otherwise.
Yeah. Are there any other ways that technology is being used to fight fraud?
Absolutely. We're also seeing things like predictive modeling,
Okay.
which is used to assess the likelihood of a claim being fraudulent based on various factors. And even artificial intelligence is being used to automate parts of the investigation process,
Oh, wow.
which frees up human investigators to focus on those more complex cases.
That makes sense. So technology is helping to streamline that process?
Yeah, and
of detecting and investigating fraud?
But it's not all about algorithms and data, though, right?
Right.
There's also the human element. A listener asks, what motivates people to commit workers' comp fraud? It's an interesting question that really kind of delves into the psychology behind these actions.
Yeah, it's a complex question, and there's no single answer that applies to every case.
Sure.
But we do see some common motivators pop up.
Okay, like what?
Sometimes it's simple financial gain,
Okay.
a desire for easy money.
Yeah.
Other times it might stem from a sense of entitlement, a belief that they deserve compensation even if they weren't legitimately injured.
So it could range from opportunistic greed to a genuine sense of grievance,
Exactly.
even if that grievance isn't necessarily justified.
Right, and some individuals might feel like the system is unfair, or they might simply be unaware of the serious consequences of their actions.
Right. So it's a good reminder that there are those complex factors at play.
Yeah,
And understanding those motivations can help us develop more effective prevention strategies.
absolutely.
Speaking of prevention, a provider asks, what can providers do to educate themselves and their staff about workers' comp fraud? It's kind of a proactive approach to tackling the issue head-on.
Yeah, education is key. Staying informed is really your first line of defense against fraud.
Okay.
And thankfully, there are a ton of resources available for providers,
Oh, good.
including online courses, webinars, articles, and even industry conferences that focus specifically on fraud prevention.
It sounds like a wealth of information out there for those that seek it.
There is, but it's not enough for just the provider to be informed.
Right.
It's really crucial to make fraud awareness training a regular part of your staff development program.
Okay.
The more your entire team knows about the different types of fraud, the warning signs, the proper reporting procedures, the better equipped they'll be to protect your practice.
Knowledge is power when it comes to preventing fraud.
Absolutely.
Now let's shift our focus to the role of insurers.
Yeah.
A listener asks, what are insurers doing to combat workers' comp fraud? It really highlights the shared responsibility in this ongoing battle.
Yeah, insurers are right on the front lines of this fight, and they're investing heavily in resources and technology to detect and prevent fraud.
Okay.
So they're using those sophisticated data analytics tools that we talked about earlier to identify those suspicious claims patterns. And they're conducting thorough investigations to verify the legitimacy of claims.
So they're trying to weed out that fraud before it ends up costing more money.
Exactly. And they're also working closely with law enforcement agencies
Okay.
to prosecute those who commit fraud. So they're sending a clear message
Right.
that this behavior won't be tolerated.
So it's a collaborative effort involving all these stakeholders. Everyone's playing a crucial role. Now let's zoom out a little bit and look at the bigger picture. A listener asks, what is the long-term impact of workers' comp fraud on the system as a whole?
Workers' comp fraud really undermines the integrity of the entire system.
Okay.
It erodes trust between employers, employees, and insurers. It drives up costs for everyone involved.
Right.
And it makes it harder for legitimate injured workers to receive the benefits that they deserve.
So it creates that climate of suspicion,
Yeah, and distrust.
which ultimately harms everyone.
Exactly.
So it's a sobering reminder that, the consequences of fraud reach far beyond just those immediate financial losses. It impacts the very fabric of the system
Right.
and its ability to function fairly and effectively.
Absolutely.
Now, our next question brings us back to the human element again.
Okay.
A listener asks, what role does ethical conduct play in preventing workers' comp fraud? It's a question that gets to the heart of the matter.
It does. Ethical conduct is really paramount in preventing fraud. And it's about creating a culture of honesty, integrity, and accountability within your practice. You know, when everyone understands the importance of ethical behavior and the consequences of unethical actions, it creates a strong deterrent against fraud.
Right, so it starts from the top down.
Exactly. It sets the tone. And it's also about fostering an environment where everyone feels comfortable speaking up if they see something that seems wrong. That open communication is vital to catching potential fraud early on.
Now, let's look ahead a little bit. A listener asks, what are some emerging trends in workers' comp fraud prevention? Looking to the future of this ongoing challenge.
Yeah, it's exciting to think about how we can continue to improve our efforts to combat fraud. So one emerging trend is the use of artificial intelligence and machine learning to detect and prevent fraud.
Okay.
You know, these technologies are becoming increasingly sophisticated.
Right.
And they're able to analyze vast amounts of data to identify patterns and anomalies that human investigators might miss.
So we have like another set of eyes, but they're super sharp.
Exactly. What other trends are emerging in this space?
Well, another important trend is the increasing focus on collaboration and information sharing
Okay.
among all the stakeholders. So insurers, employers, providers, and even law enforcement agencies. By working together and sharing data, we can create a more comprehensive and coordinated approach to fraud prevention.
So it's all about breaking down those silos and working together.
Exactly, a united front
Yeah.
against fraud.
I like it. And then finally, there's a growing emphasis on education and awareness training. You know, we touched on this earlier, but it bears repeating.
Right.
The more everyone involved in the workers' comp system understands about fraud prevention and the role they can play in combating it, the more effective our efforts will be.
So it's about empowering everyone to be part of the solution.
Exactly.
Now let's talk about a specific step providers can take to protect themselves. A provider asks, what are some tips for documenting patient encounters in a way that minimizes the risk of fraud? It really highlights the importance of that meticulous record keeping.
Yeah, documentation is absolutely crucial when it comes to preventing and defending against fraud allegations.
Okay.
It's really essential to document patient encounters thoroughly, accurately, and objectively. Remember, these records could be scrutinized in a legal setting,
Right.
so it's vital that they are clear, concise, and above all, truthful.
So what specific advice would you give to providers about documentation?
So first and foremost, be specific and detailed in your documentation.
Yeah.
Avoid vague or ambiguous language, and use precise medical terminology to describe the patient's condition and your treatment plan.
So it's about being clear and concise, leaving no room for interpretation.
Exactly. You want to paint a very clear picture of the patient's situation and the rationale behind your decisions.
Okay, what else should providers keep in mind?
It's also important to document both objective and subjective findings.
Okay.
So clearly differentiate between what the patient reports experiencing and what you observe during the examination.
So it's about painting that complete and balanced picture.
Exactly. That distinction is critical in establishing the validity of the patient's complaints, and it can be crucial in a fraud investigation.
And are there any other tips for ensuring that documentation is accurate and comprehensive?
Absolutely. Be consistent in your documentation.
Okay.
Ensure that your notes are legible, complete, and signed and dated.
So it really shows that attention to detail.
Yeah, consistency demonstrates professionalism and attention to detail, and it shows that you're taking your documentation seriously, which can go a long way in building credibility if your records are ever questioned.
So you're creating that clear and comprehensive record that accurately reflects that patient encounter.
Exactly. And if there are any discrepancies or inconsistencies between the patient's reported symptoms and your findings, document them carefully.
Okay.
Don't try to downplay or ignore those inconsistencies. Instead, address them head on and explain your reasoning for any differences.
So transparency is key.
Absolutely. Addressing these issues directly rather than trying to brush them under the rug helps to build trust and demonstrate your commitment to ethical practices.
And finally, if the patient provides any information that you believe may be relevant to a potential fraud investigation.
Okay.
Document it thoroughly and objectively.
Yeah.
This might include statements about their job duties, the circumstances of their injury,
Right.
or any interactions they've had with their employer or their insurer.
It's about ensuring that all pertinent information is captured and preserved.
Exactly. Even if it doesn't seem relevant at the time, you never know what could be crucial down the line.
Exactly. Good documentation is your best defense against fraud allegations. It demonstrates that you've been diligent, ethical, and thorough in your practice.
Right.
And just as importantly, it helps to maintain the integrity of the workers' comp system as a whole.
Yeah, it sounds like thorough and accurate documentation
Yeah.
is really the foundation of protecting yourself and the integrity of the system.
It is. It really is.
We've covered a lot of ground today, from those subtle signs of potential fraud to the larger kind of systemic impacts. But before we wrap up, is there like a key takeaway that you want our listeners to remember from our conversation today?
I think the big thing is that workers' comp fraud, it's a serious issue, but it's not insurmountable.
Right.
By staying informed, being proactive in our practices, and working together, we can really create a more ethical and sustainable system.
Yeah, a system that works for everyone.
Exactly. And I want to thank all of our listeners for sending in such thoughtful questions.
Yes, thank you.
It's clear that this is a topic that you're really engaged with, and that's encouraging.
We appreciate you all tuning in and being part of this conversation.
Yeah.
And remember, if you have any further questions or concerns about workers' comp fraud, please don't hesitate to reach out.
Yeah, we're always here to help.
And if you suspect fraud, report it.
Yes, please do.
There are those confidential channels available to protect you and keep you anonymous.
Your voice matters.
It really does. Speaking up is crucial to protecting the system.
Yes.
And making sure that everyone involved is treated fairly.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today on Workers Comp Unwrapped.
It was my pleasure.
Until next time, stay informed, stay vigilant, and stay ethical.
And keep those questions coming.
Yes, we love hearing from you.